The government want a 10% increase in biodiversity net gain. It's something that you can't avoid, and it is going to really, over the next year or so, going to impact land values. We had Ian from Biodiversity Unit, and he basically coordinates and helps developers buy biodiversity net gain credits from various different habitats around the UK.
Fundamentally, if I could give you one top tip, is make sure the ecologist that you're working with, your particular property or development or land that you're working with, understands biodiversity.
We've managed to get 20 and 30 architects and built environment professionals in the room. We put it on as XP surveys. The idea is that most of the people in that room are people that we want to serve. And it's an event that, we get a lot of success from a business perspective, bringing those people together, a lot of exposure within the right network and the right target audience. But also we're learning lots as well, because the speakers that we've had involved in our events are people that we can work within our businesses. We've had Claire Truman, who's heritage consultant, give us some really useful information on listed buildings that Jack's been talking about a lot. We've had a guy from Lumi Plugin, which is a really interesting product that integrates LED lighting with other fittings like sprinkler heads, heat detectors, smoke detectors, all in one fitting, so you can reduce that ceiling acne. A guy from Loxon, Cameron I think his name was, talking about home automation, the availability of how to integrate different services within your home to work remotely and via apps, etc. This week we had Ian from Biodiversity Unit, that's his company name, isn't it? And he basically coordinates and helps developers buy biodiversity net gain credits from various different habitats around the UK. So for those of you that don't know what biodiversity net gain is, really do need to look this up and understand what's happening in that space, because as of I think April this year, it affects absolutely every development that you're going to be working on. The government want a 10% increase in biodiversity net gain. It's something that you can't avoid, and it is going to really over the next year or so going to impact land values, and there'll be a lot of people overpaying for sites and agreeing levels that they shouldn't be, because actually they've got a 50-60 grand biodiversity net gain bill that they have to pay to offset what they can't do on site. So scrub up on your biodiversity net gain information.
It was actually a very interesting topic, because I feel that biodiversity is an unknown, and we had 20 people in the room, and the first question was, can you just explain what this is? And we've never had that before, because you don't normally say to a planning consultant, how does planning work? So it was really walking through the motions and understanding how the biodiversity works. It is actually a huge change that's coming into play. The government are now saying by law you have to improve the site by 10%. But what you've got to remember is if you're removing 50% of the land there, you've got to improve the site by 60%, because you're subtracting away from its original stance. And fundamentally, if I could give you one top tip to take away from what I took away from the particular site, is make sure the ecologist that you're working with your particular property or development or land that you're working with, understands biodiversity. They're commercially minded and they want to work with you, and they understand the starting point and the end point. Because what you will find is, if you're going down the sort of route of just instructing someone because they're the first on Google and not actually anticipating that they understand what you're trying to do and want to work with you, you really will be in a much worse position from instructing the wrong ecologist. I definitely recommend that you have your ducks in a row and they understand the ecology and BNG, so that you can work with them to sort of cooperate with that. And it also seems that ecologist, if they are pragmatic about how they do work, you might actually remove trees before you particularly put in the application or do the biodiversity initial assessment. It's crazy, it's going to be costly and impactful, and I'd highly recommend that you study this space, which you can do by coming to events like ours.
Yeah, I think, Jack, actually one of the key things that I took away was one of your comments that you sort of had to go through on one of your sites, where effectively to get around some of the requirements, you've reduced the red line boundary in your planning application. If you're working in one area, want to develop one area of the building, and you've got a wild meadow for the rest of the site, by restricting the red line boundary that you're applying for planning permission in, you're only improving that red line boundary with a net gain of 10%, rather than looking at the wider picture, which has a wild flower meadow and ponds and all this sort of stuff, which is high ecological value. So a 10% improvement on a high ecological value thing is a massive improvement, whereas 10% improvement on something that's shit or tarmac that has no ecological value. One of the other things is that a biodiversity credit will cost you somewhere between 26 and 28 grand as a typical sort of rule of thumb. The key thing is how many units you actually need to offset on site. And he was talking through a private house that was having work done to it where the actual credit amount was 0.044 or something stupid like that, and it cost them 600 quid. Get to know your ecologists, like Jack says, work with people like Ian to try and be that middleman. They have access across the UK to all these outsourced and habitats that are being created specifically where you buy these credits. So if you can't provide the requirement on site, you'll have to do it off site. And he has really good connections around the UK with habitats that provide units to you for a cost. You also need a 30-year management plan in place. So if you try to create an on-site biodiversity, try to tick the box on site, you also have to have a 30-year program to maintain that space. So if you put a wildflower meadow at the end of your new houses, there's got to be a 30-year program in place. Now, how does that work legally? Do you have to write that into the contract? Is any person that's buying that property going to see that in the legal process and be like, oh God, that sounds like a nightmare. I don't really want that. I'm going to either chip the price or go elsewhere. So it might be cheaper to provide it on site if you can, but then you're lumbered with the 30-year management of it. Whereas if you're buying off-plan credits units, then that responsibility goes over to that habitat provider. So there's really a lot to this, and you should absolutely brush up on your BNG.